Good morning, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to join us on MHA's webinar on Brexit. Are you ready? My name is Patrick King. I'm a tax partner in MHA and chairman of our national tax group. We have quite a busy schedule this morning for the next couple of hours or so, and I hope you'll find it interesting and helpful rather than scary, although there might be some of that as well. We'll start with some thoughts on the economic situation, and I'm delighted to be able to announce we have Professor Joe Nellis from Cranfield School of Management, who will be talking to us first with his take on the interesting times in which we live. After Joe's talk, we shall move on to some of the real practical issues you need to be aware of and act upon in the customs duty and VAT areas. And if you're trading with the EU, I have a number of speakers on the VAT side, although I have to admit we're having a few technical difficulties this morning in that a couple of them can't actually get in at the moment. I'm hoping that during Joe's speech they will be able to join. If not, they may be joining in by phone or something like that, which hopefully will still do the trick. After the VAT and customs bit, which I have to say is probably the most important thing when looking at Brexit, we'll have myself and Richard Maitland talking about some direct tax issues. But the indirect tax side will be dealt with by Alison Horner and Jonathan Main, who are both VAT partners with MHA. And we also have Marissa Hoot on from Baker Tilly, Netherlands, to give us an EU perspective, and Andrew Thurston, if we can overcome the technical issues, to deal with the customs side. After all the talks, we hope to have some time for some questions and answers. We may not get through everybody, but we'll certainly do our best. And don't worry if your question's not answered, because we will try to come back to people afterwards. You can ask your questions anytime during the presentation by clicking on the Q&A button, which on my screen at least is down at the bottom in the middle, but if you move your cursor, you should be able to see it, probably down the bottom. Sometimes it appears at the side, so just be aware of that. And we will, here and there during the presentation, have some polling questions for you as well. So as and when they come up, please just hit the relevant button on your screen to give your answer to that. That'd be most useful. I think that's everything I was going to say at the start. So just without further ado then, let me hand over to Joe for his always fascinating take on the economic situation. And I have to say, the only negative I'd ever say about Joe is he tends to be more popular than me when we share a panel. So over to you, Joe.
Thank you very much, Patrick, and good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be online, although I'm sure we'll all agree these are challenging times, not only involving Brexit, but of course involving COVID. So I'm going to share my screen, and I hope everything goes according to plan. And that's a mountain, Kilimanjaro, but you now should see in a moment my first slide. And unless somebody says otherwise, I'm assuming you can see that slide. So without further ado, let me just go straight into this point. We've 55 days to go and still no trade deal. I want to come back to that at the end of the presentation, and no doubt it'll be a topic for discussion later. But the clock is ticking. Of that, there is no doubt. And it's going to pass very quickly. But of course, in the meantime, we've got to deal with a lot of uncertainty in the economy, in addition to the uncertainty created by Brexit. And so I've just got a few things to talk about here to try and give you as much information as possible. I'd like to put this into the context of the global economy and give you the latest picture. But of course, I'm going to focus on the UK economy and simply address three questions. Where are we? Where are we going? And perhaps most importantly, what are the risks ahead? Those of you who know me will know that I'm an optimist. But in the current climate, it's hard to feel too optimistic, despite what the Bank of England says about the recovery, and it may come sometime next year. I think it's going to be a long, slow recovery back to some sense of normality. As I say, we are going to have time for Q&A, but we decided perhaps maybe best to leave those to the end of the morning. In other words, I'll present, and you will then have time to reflect and perhaps to think of some of your difficult questions. And we will come back to those towards the end of the morning. So, very briefly, the latest figures on the global economy were produced just a few weeks ago. Of course, they're guesstimates. Nobody is absolutely certain of what's going to happen because of the possibility of more lockdowns across the world and travel bans. But at the moment, you'll see that this year, the world is expected to shrink by more than 4%, minus 4.4 according to IMF, and with a bounce back next year. That's great news. That's the classic V-shaped recovery that you've heard about. It will not be equally dispersed across the world. It's likely that the advanced economies will bounce back more slowly next year, despite a significant drop that's forecast for this year, almost 6% drop this year, and perhaps a bounce back next year of 3.9%. I think we should keep an eye on the emerging markets and developing economies around the world, because the recession that they will have this year, they're having this year, will not be as deep as many other parts of the world, and their bounce back will be much stronger, which is interesting from their perspective. And I think that's something, well, I will discuss later, but it represents, I think, a potentially significant change in the balance of trade internationally. I've pulled together from the IMF various parts of the world here, and I've imposed on the IMF data my own V-shape, just to highlight this point once again, the classic V-shaped recovery, down sharply and up sharply, which is not surprising really, given the scale of the fall this year. The United States, despite whatever happens in the election over there, will have a bounce back and will come back quite strongly. The euro area is going to have a significant drop this year, along with the UK, by the way, and I will, of course, talk about the UK later, with a bounce back next year that will not compensate for the fall this year. Similarly, in Latin America and the Caribbean, a significant fall this year of over 8% and a bounce back next year. And of course, other areas you can see for yourselves. But I say the right-hand one is the interesting one, the emerging and developing Asia in particular. Small fall this year in that part of the world, but a significant bounce back next year, to a large extent because of China. China in 2020 will not report a recession this year, and is expected to grow strongly next year and pull the region with it. But again, I am going to discuss this in some detail later. Just pulling together some of the particular countries, and I'm not going to go down this slide, so relax. Just to highlight, and again, these are the IMF figures. It doesn't mean they're right. It's simply an external independent assessment of various parts of the world. Just want to highlight the UK figure. You may have heard the Bank of England governor last night say that he expects the UK to fall this year by about 10%, and that's in line with the IMF forecast, which actually predates the second announcement of the furlough. And next year, a bounce back perhaps of 6%, but I have a very strong feeling that that forecast is going to be downgraded by the IMF, given that we're now into a second lockdown. Again, I will come back to it. And again, just other parts of the world. And by the way, you're going to get a copy of these slides after the event, so you don't need to panic that you can't read them. I'm not going down each line. I just want to highlight the one I mentioned earlier. It's expected that by the end of 2020, China will not have experienced a recession. That is a remarkable prediction, and China is already growing. They went into the crisis first, and they've come out of it first, and they're now focusing on stimulating their domestic economy to the extent that they will have a positive growth figure this year. And of course, their international trade has been affected, but that then highlights the extent to which they're focusing on their domestic economy, as we are as well. And next year, at the moment, a forecast of more than 8% growth in China. And you'll also notice, by the way, the line beneath that, India even stronger. And I think those two countries are the two key countries to watch in terms of the emerging markets, for next year and for many years thereafter. I want to just finish this very brief overview of the global economy by introducing to you this concept that's now known as the spheres of influence. And I want to emphasize this point. I personally think, and again, I may be wrong, but it's just a personal view. I think we are seeing a significant change in the spheres of influence across the world. And I think this change is going to accelerate because of COVID-19. And I just want to emphasize and explain this to you. Clearly, the USA has been and still is the major sphere of influence in the world. the balance of power, the size of the US. The US accounts for more than 20% of global GDP. And of course, the countries that align themselves with the USA. And that's important for the UK, of course, particularly post-Brexit, to make sure that we align ourselves with, as many spheres of influence as possible. And the US, obviously, is a key ally of ours. But depending on the outcome of the US election, I think the sphere of influence of the USA is changing. Under Trump's leadership, it has been more inward focused, more, I use the word politely, more nationalistic, more protectionist, as we've seen vis-a-vis USA and China, USA and Europe, etc. So I think the US sphere of influence is changing. That could develop even further in a positive way post-election, depending upon who is elected. Of course, I think we'll all agree that the EU sphere of influence is vital, is very important. Economically, the EU is similar in size to the USA, with a larger population, bigger population than the USA. But of course, we're leaving the EU, and that is going to change the EU's sphere of influence. At the same time, the EU is going through a significant number of economic challenges. That the so-called North-South divide is opening up quite quickly in the EU. And now we have Italy in severe trouble. France is not looking strong at all, along with the Mediterranean countries. So the EU sphere of influence is very fragile. And I think that's of concern, not only to the EU, but should be of concern to us as well, because the EU will remain as our biggest trading partner for many years to come. So that's an important point to note. But I think the key aspect, and looking ahead at the forecast for the future, I think the sphere of influence of China, and I've added Russia into this in terms of a collective. And remember, when I use the phrase sphere of influence, I'm also including the countries that are aligned with these areas, with China and Russia. And I have an expectation, and I'm going to put this to you quite directly. Given the current COVID crisis, given that China has come out of it first, and given the deep pockets that China has, the vast reserves of dollars, they hold more dollars than any other country in the world outside of the USA, of course. Here's my prediction. I believe that China will accelerate its influence across the world by investing even more in more countries post-COVID. You may say that's wrong, and I accept that. But if I were the Chinese government, that's what I would be doing right now. It's an opportunity for China to expand its sphere of influence. It has the money. It's the right time. It's now growing. At a time when other countries are going to need help, I think many countries will be glad to have China's help, despite all of the problems associated with that. Particularly in Africa and developing countries where China has been criticized for buying up assets very cheaply, but at least they're paying for them, which is a positive message. So my key point, as I finish my brief overview of the global economy, is I think we are seeing right now an acceleration of the change in the balance of power and the change in trade relationships at a rate that is faster than many of us could have expected pre-COVID. And again, it's a viewpoint which you may or may not agree with, of course. So from that point, let me now come to the UK economy. And I don't think there'll be any surprise in what I'm going to say next. In answering the question, where are we? I think we know exactly where we are. We have a problem, to put it mildly. GDP this year is going to fall somewhere between 9.5% and 12.5%. Bank of England thinks about 10%, and I'm happy to accept that. If it's only 10%, I'll be relieved in many ways. We are seeing a bounce back in Q3, and we had expected that bounce back in the third quarter, which is now finished, but the figures aren't published yet. We're expecting it to be of the region of 15% in the third quarter. But of course, we're now going into the fourth quarter, and I'll mention that in a moment because of the new lockdown. But the bounce back that has happened in Q3 is not a big surprise. a lot of demand was building up. Consumers holding on to the money, a lot of precautionary savings. They didn't go on foreign holidays. You may not have bought a car. You've got some money in the bank which you haven't been spending. Well, in Q3, you have been spending it. Of course, the housing market has been particularly active in Q3 because of the stamp duty holiday and the very, very low borrowing rates that are available and will remain low for a very long time. And of course, we've also seen unprecedented government intervention, government borrowing, government spending, pumping money into the economy, as well as the Bank of England's quantitative easing, pumping in money into the economy and driving down the longer term interest rates. But GDP growth in August, now we don't normally have monthly figures for GDP, but the Office for National Statistics has now introduced estimates for monthly GDP growth because of this crisis. And so these are only rough estimates, but the latest figures, which came out only in August, suggest that we grew by only 2% in August, when it was expected to be about 5%. So growth has slowed down faster than expected. And that's a problem in going forward. And now we're in Q4. We're only just at the start of Q4, of course, in October, November, December. But because of the lockdown, we're now expecting to see a negative GDP growth. In other words, a decline in GDP in Q4, perhaps by 2 or 3%. Obviously, nobody knows yet, but the Bank of England is certainly signaling that and managing our expectations already. So the second lockdown ends on December the 2nd, and no doubt there will be a bounce back in spending, provided there isn't another lockdown. And with the extension of the furlough scheme till March 31st, one wonders what else has the government got prepared for us, or perhaps it'll be last minute decision making. In terms of business investment, and if you've heard me speak before at many other McIntyre Hudson events, you'll know that my biggest concern for the UK economy is business investment. And I'm going to say it again, and I'm sure you've heard me say it, but investment is the engine of growth. Investment creates the capacity to produce in the future. And our investment spending has been very, very poor for some time. As a result of that, productivity in this country has not been performing well for at least a decade. Well, this COVID crisis, along with uncertainty surrounding Brexit, has meant that investment spending has been held back. And by this year alone, we're expecting business investment spending to fall by perhaps over 20%. And perhaps with more falls next year. At the moment, we're predicting about a 3.5% fall in investment spending in 2021 and a recovery in 2022. But, this might be the most optimistic scenario because of the uncertainty that I've mentioned already. The Bank of England just yesterday, and I've included yesterday's figures in this, they've signaled that they're ready, willing, and able to support business. So they announced yesterday, as I'm sure you now all know, another injection of quantitative easing of £150 billion. That now brings the total QE in this phase to £875 billion. Yes, £875 billion. And what it means is the Bank of England has bought bonds in the market and has intentionally driven up the price of bonds. So we've got a bond price boom at the moment. And the consequence of that is it has driven down the yield on bonds. Now, the yield on 10-year government bonds is the benchmark for the long-term cost of capital. So in other words, the Bank of England has deliberately, and I'm glad they have done, they've driven down the long-term borrowing costs, rates of interest. And that's been great for the government because the government's borrowed lots of money. It's great for business because it's cheaper to borrow for long term, if only you want to invest more in your business. And of course, it's great for mortgages. It's driven down fixed rate mortgages, of course. All intentional, by the way, but this cannot last forever. And the base rate, so the quantitative easing is concerned with the long-term cost of borrowing. The base rate, of course, is the short-term interest rate, overdrafts and so on. And it's now down to record lows. It's now 0.1%. And the Bank of England has mentioned that they are looking at the possibility of negative rates. I personally don't think it's going to happen. There's my head on the block, but I don't think it really matters very much because rates of 0.1 or minus 0.1 are described as pushing on a string. I don't think they're going to have much effect. In any case, I don't think negative rates will apply to the personal sector, to savings. I think that all the banks will protect their customers from negative rates. Negative rates could be applied to the corporate sector. In other words, banks could start charging you a fee to hold your money and earn zero. In other words, a negative return when you allow for fees. But this at the moment is just speculation. We don't know for certain. It hasn't happened yet in this country ever. But as I said earlier, there are a number of uncertainties that are looming, and again, no surprises here. Rising unemployment is a major concern. The Bank of England thinks unemployment will almost double in the coming year, and that's clearly why the furlough scheme's been extended until March the 31st to try and stave off as much increase in unemployment as possible. We're now in the middle of the second lockdown, and there are tighter COVID restrictions. And I'm sure we're all wondering, are there more restrictions to follow? Will there be a third lockdown? Will there be a fourth lockdown? And I hope not. Of course, I hope not. And then, of course, bring us back to Brexit. There's the future of UK-EU trade relationships. Are we really going to have a no deal Brexit? And I'm quite certain that's one of your questions to me later. I don't think there will be no deal. I think there'll be some deal, but it will be a last minute deal. It won't be comprehensive. The most likely scenario is there'll be a deal to agree that we'll keep on talking. But there is no way we're going to get a comprehensive deal, of course, in the next 7 weeks. That's just is not possible in the next 55 days. So I'm sure we'll come back to this, of course. There's some very up-to-date data. This came out last night. I grabbed it off the BBC website. I've given them acknowledgement of that, of course. Just to put this in context, in the financial crisis, quantitative easing, that's the amount of bonds the Bank of England bought. In other words, they injected money into the system, liquidity into the banks, into the pension funds, into the insurance companies, into the corporates, to try and encourage spending and lending for investment purposes. In the financial crisis, it amounted to 200 billion only. In the Euro debt crisis, 3 years later, it was 375 billion. In the Brexit referendum result, which caused some uncertainty, you'll see it was 445 billion. And now we have this huge figure here of 895 billion pounds so far. And this is history in the making. Of course, the Bank of England can reverse all of this in the coming years. They are now holding bonds and injected liquidity, so they can reverse that in the coming years. In terms of where we've come from and where we're going to, I just grabbed, again, the latest ONS data. That they've not updated this information yet. New figures will come out any day soon. This just shows you how well the economy was doing post-financial crisis. You'll see from the low point in 2008, if I take an index, and it was a steady growth. We've done very, very well, by the way. Let's be very clear, better than many other countries. Not rapid growth, but steady growth. And then you'll notice the cliff point here back at the start of the year in March, and a huge drop, in the economy, which is now history. From February, the high point, down to where we are today, we're still about 9% below where we were. Of course, we had fallen by about 25% at some point, but we're now at about 9% below where we were. And that may improve slightly when we get the third quarter figures, but not significantly, unfortunately. Inflation is not a problem. Inflation continues to fall. The latest figures have been published for September. Inflation is only 0.7%. Many people would argue that this downward trend, of course, symbolizes deflation. I don't see consumer price inflation being a problem for a very long time. Now, note what I've just said. Consumer price inflation is not a problem. Of course, we have got asset price inflation. You can argue whether that's a problem or not. In other words, bond prices are rising at an all-time high. Property prices are rising. That's another asset. And the stock market, despite the worst crisis in our history, the stock market is doing okay. I'm not going to say it's booming, by the way, but one could have predicted an even bigger fall in the stock market. But of course, the amount of quantitative easing has been pumping liquidity into these markets to maintain their values to some extent. Unemployment is starting to rise already. Our low point just 6 months ago was 3.8%, and it's now beginning to creep up. It's now at 4.5%, and will keep on rising. But of course, the furlough scheme being extended to March 31st will slow down the increase in unemployment until then. There will still be rises in unemployment, but they will not rise as quickly. I think we should all be concerned about the youth unemployment, the 16 to 24 age category. It's very high at the moment, and it's going to get higher. I think that's of concern for the future, of course, and I'm sure the government is keeping a very close eye on that. Useful slide here, useful, I'm not sure that's necessarily the case, but an important slide. This is from the HMRC, and PwC provided a very nice table here, a graph, just to capture a lot of information. The red lines show the number of employees employed in each of these sectors. So wholesale and retail is the biggest sector, then health and education, and so on. The right-hand column shows the percentage of the sector employees who were furloughed in the first furlough. It's just to give you a sense of how big this impact was on certain sectors. And you'll notice, for example, in construction, it was 60% were furloughed. In wholesale and retail, 42%. In accommodation and food service, hotels all closed down, etc., etc. Art, entertainment, recreation, 70%. Again, significant people on furlough. And of course, we're going to see something similar to this in the second furlough that we've now just begun a few days ago. Let me just get my next point here. There you go. In terms of public sector net borrowing, so remember that this is, it's the borrowing that's taking place each year. Now, this year, we only have figures so far from April to September. The year isn't over yet. And already in this year, the government has borrowed the equivalent of 9.7% of GDP, which is more than £200 billion of government net borrowing, excluding the public sector banks. And to put that in context, if you look back at the previous 27 years, clearly we're now in the all-time record. If you take it back even further than that, if you go back to the interwar years, it gives you a sense of the size of public sector debt. This is not the annual borrowing, but the total outstanding debt, the national debt. You'll see, by the way, we're still a long way short from the size of the debt that we had back in the Great Depression and the end of World War II. But in terms of percentages, we're now at 103.5% of GDP. We now have a national debt of something like 2 trillion, bigger than the UK economy. And at some point in time, well, that has to stop rising. Now, there is good news. Let me be very clear. The good news is that the cost of servicing the national debt is affordable because, remember, the bond yields are exceptionally, historically low. That's the good news. But the debt at the end of World War II took many years before we got back down to a level of debt that was regarded as acceptable, let's say 40, 50% of GDP. So, this period, in a 9-month period, we've seen a dramatic increase in our national debt, but we're still able to afford to service that. So let's be clear. This is debt that, sadly, we're going to be passing on to our children and our grandchildren. And as long as the cost of servicing it remains modest, that's okay. Of course, that may not last forever. I think PwC have done some useful research here on regional scenarios. And again, without going into every region in detail, what this graph shows you is that the red bars shows you the extent to which regions have seen a fall in their GDP as a result of the crises. These are all negatives, by the way. And the yellow arrow shows you what they expect to happen if there's a further outbreak. Well, we now have a further outbreak. In other words, they're expecting the economy to slow down even further. The UK is highlighted here, and you can pick out various reasons for yourselves. London is the least affected. That's the far right-hand side. But nevertheless, we're in the east of England, of course, and we have been severely affected, along with all other reasons, by the way. London less affected for the simple reason that, if you're an office worker, if you work in a bank, if you work in financial services, it's much easier to work from home. And as a result of that, therefore, the negative impact on GDP is less. Still important, but less than many other regions, which are more reliant perhaps on manufacturing. So up in the Northeast, for example, particularly with Nissan factory, it's hard to, you can't work from home if you work on a building site, obviously, or if you work in a car factory, et cetera, et cetera. So the furlough scheme has helped, but it hasn't replaced that output. So where are we going? And that's the biggest question today, obviously. Looking backwards isn't very helpful, but it puts it into context. So where are we going? We are expecting a return to growth in 2021. We're expecting it in the fourth quarter, but now that's been pushed back because of the furlough. But I need to stress this, and I'm quite certain that most people will agree with this. The return to growth is going to be gradual. I simply cannot envisage a rapid return. In other words, the V-shaped recovery is not going to be as sharp as we would like, sadly. And some are therefore calling it a U-shaped recovery, a slower recovery. There may even be a W shape, a double dip, which I'll come back to in a moment. The Bank of England does not expect growth to return to does not expect the size of the economy to get back to where it was at the start of this crisis until at least 2022. Now, I personally think the Bank of England is being optimistic when they predict 2022 as being the year we get back to where we were at the end of 2019. Many other economists are of the view, and many other forecasting organizations are of the view that it's going to be later than that. The so-called Item Club, the Independent Treasury Economic Modelling Group hosted by EY, they don't expect the economy to get back to where it was until 2024. And of course, all of these forecasts are subject to an effective vaccine and distribution of the vaccine, as well as a returned business confidence and consumer confidence. And many things can happen in the coming months to throw us off track. But I think it is right for all of us to reflect on the very strong possibility that recovery will be long and slow. I wish that was incorrect, but I cannot see it any other way given where we are at the moment. I don't think consumer price inflation will be a problem. We may see some small increases in the coming 12 months. It's not going to be an issue. Consumer price inflation will stay below target or close to target. It's off the agenda. And as a result of that, both short-term interest rates, the Bank of England or the MPC interest rate, will remain historically low for several years to come. And I'm hoping and I expect that long-term borrowing rates will also remain low. The Bank of England is not going to suddenly reverse quantitative easing. It knows the consequence. It knows that if it reverses quantitative easing, bond yields will go up, long-term borrowing rates will go up, and the economy will suffer. And I do not believe they're going to let that happen. It simply would be suicide. Then, of course, I've mentioned already, and I need to emphasize it again, we've got this huge government debt to deal with at some time in the future. And I have a concern, and I've heard it on every news program in the last few days as well, and I'm sure you've heard the same news programs. The scale of this debt, at some point the government will have to start tackling it. And the question then is, how will they tackle it? Does that mean that there will be hard decisions regarding the support from government once the crisis is over? And I just want to raise this as a question. Who's going to bear the brunt of adjustment? And that's code, by the way, for who's going to pay most when the government starts to raise taxes and to reduce government spending? Which sectors of the economy? Will it be the corporate sector? Will it be the personal sector? Will it be on VAT? Will it be an income tax? Will it be a wealth tax? Will it be the older generations? I don't know. I really don't know. Nobody knows at the moment. I suspect it'll be a broad-based adjustment for all of us. I think there'll be very few people who will escape the burden that will come, whenever that is, by the way. Again, the latest figures came out yesterday. These are from the Bank of England last night, and I'm sure you're all well aware of it. Just to highlight the point that I made before, we've gone down sharply in Q2. We've come back up in Q3, and I predicted earlier 15%, and that's approximately right. And now the Bank of England is predicting a fall in Q4 again. So there's the so-called W, although not as steep a fall in Q4 as might have happened. It all depends on now the furlough and how we behave in the coming weeks and months. And the Bank of England is expecting a small, modest growth thereafter. And still, even with growth that they're predicting, and there's no guarantee of the growth, but with that growth, they're not expecting us to get back to where we started from, as I said, until 2022. Double dip. Well, strictly speaking, we will not have a double dip recession unless Q1 in 2021 is also negative. A recession is defined as at least 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth. We had 2 quarters this year. In the first half of this year, we got 1 quarter of growth, and now we're going to get another quarter of negative growth. So we can argue about the words. It's not a double dip as such, but it's going to feel like it, of course, for some sectors. Again, going back to PwC's latest research, I think is very useful. They've produced forecasts, again, for the economy, very similar to Bank of England, but they've shown them combined under a contained spread or under a further outbreak. Now, the further outbreak, we're in the second wave. I think there's no point in avoiding that comment. And so before this second wave hit us a few weeks ago, under the contained spread, the PwC were expecting us to get back to an index of 100, and it was back to where we started from, Q4 2019, perhaps in the latter part of 2021. If you now look at the red line, and if you project that forward into the future, this red line, it's going to be, I think, 2 or 3 more years after 2021 before we get back to the index of 100 up here, which is at the start of the crisis. Again, doesn't make it right. It's a basis for planning. And of course, it doesn't help business confidence. I understand that. But you have to plan your businesses in the context of what you believe is going to happen, in the context of realism in your own minds, not on the basis of a wide range of forecasts, of course. Again, before this second wave hit us, under the contained spread, and it was being contained until recently, this diagram shows that the hit in terms of growth by sector. The yellow arrow showed the tremendous hit in the early part on those sectors. So hotels and transport and so on had a tremendous fall in their growth rates. And of course, before this new wave, that we were expecting in 2021 a significant recovery in a number of sectors, and the ones that were hardest hit. In other words, the bounce back. Well, we're now in a second wave, and unfortunately, all sectors are going to have, at best, a modest recovery next year, and indeed, some are going to have even bigger downturns this year because that previous diagram. The year hadn't finished, and now we've got another lockdown, so it's going to be an even bigger hit on some sectors, which is not good news, of course. Unfortunately, I see that finance and insurance are least hit because I said earlier, many people are able to work from home in the financial services sector, of course. In fact, most people, all people can work from home in those sectors. Okay, so where are we going? Well, and these are the latest figures produced by the Item Club that I mentioned earlier, the Independent Treasury Economic Modelling Group. And just to remind you, this is the group of businesses. So these are not government forecasts. This is the corporate sector's views about the economy, but using the Treasury economic model. They have access to it. They're given permission, and they're able, therefore, to use a high quality model. It's cost many millions of pounds to produce, to try and factor in their own assumptions about the economy to get the best forecast possible. So these are not political forecasts, hosted by EY, and I'm sure the business sector is very grateful for that. But the forecasts that they produced just a few weeks ago do not include, of course, the announcement of the new furlough, which was rather hastily announced last week. And of course, they will not include the extension of new lockdown, I should have said, and they will not include the extension of the furlough scheme until March 31st. So some of these forecasts will be modified, of course. But just to highlight, I remember this is when we were thinking that things were getting better, and they've now turned down. They were still expecting this year a recession of 10%, recovery next year maybe of 6%, and then getting back to normality over the next 2 or 3 years. But of course, the minus 10% is now probably going to be more by the end of the year, at minus 11 or minus 12. And I do not expect, and I'm sure the Item Club do not expect, a recovery next year of 6%. I think if we achieve 3 or 4 or 5%, we'll be celebrating. But we're going to get back down to slow, modest growth rates thereafter, once companies pick up pace again. A few other points to note here, just looking across the board. Domestic demand, again, fallen. Domestic spending, fallen this year by about 12%. I think that's going to be even more. Consumer spending, so domestic demand includes consumer spending, investment spending, and government spending. But consumer spending, again, is fallen by nearly 13%. And then the fixed investment, which is a small percentage of total spending, but nevertheless, I said earlier about 20%, over 20%. Item Club, before the second lockdown, they were predicting even then 17%. So that's why I revised that upwards to over 20%. Again, these are historic numbers, by the way, unfortunately. And then just looking across the board at a few other figures, net government borrowing, in other words, the government, again, before the second lockdown and before the extension of the furlough, they had expected to borrow about 17% of GDP. Well, that now is going to be more than 17%, obviously, more like 20% of GDP, and so on. Average earnings this year, remember, you may be surprised it says 0.5% forecast. But of course, many people have been protected this year, and so they haven't lost their job because of the furlough scheme. And inflation is off the agenda, as I said already. But those are some serious figures, and yet many of these are, well, all of these are going to be downgraded in the coming weeks as a result of the second lockdown, which is inevitable. And I say, I wish I was wrong, but there is no other way of looking at this. These were made prior to the second lockdown announcement. An important point to note. And so I'm just going to move into the last part of my presentation, slightly ahead of schedule. So I'm just warning our next speaker. There'll be a few extra minutes for the next speaker. But what are the risks ahead? And as I say, I am an optimist normally, although my hair is getting grayer, if that's possible. We have a number of risks ahead. And I've mentioned this several times. And the slow economic recovery is great news. Sorry, recovery is good news. But the pace of the recovery, I think, is going to be disappointing. And I don't think we should be overly surprised by this. Most advanced economies are now in a new phase in any case, where growth has been moderating for several years. It's unrealistic to think that we're going to suddenly have a booming economy. The world is changing, and emerging markets are coming up very strongly, and our position in the world economy therefore is changing. That's not a criticism, that's not a sign of weakness, that's a sign of realism. And of course, COVID-19 isn't helping, and Brexit, the uncertainty regarding Brexit isn't helping. The Bank of England, you may have heard this yesterday, they have estimated that if there is no trade deal done in the next 7 weeks, They think that will take between 1 and 1.5% off our GDP growth. Now, therefore, whatever recovery we're going to have, and I think it's going to be a slow recovery, it's going to be even slower, in other words, because of that uncertainty. As I say, I think there will be an agreement for what it's worth, but that agreement will have to be extended. I mean, the discussions will have to be extended because they can't possibly reach a comprehensive agreement in 7 weeks. I've emphasized this 2 or 3 times, and I have to emphasize it again. It's almost a plea to the corporate sector to appreciate the importance of this. But of course, you do appreciate the importance of this. Investment is the engine of growth. If we're not replacing our computers, if we're not replacing our machines, if we're not replacing our systems, if we're not replacing our infrastructure, then our ability to increase productivity diminishes. If we're not investing in our people, the human capital, then their skill sets tend to fall behind, tend to lag behind. And we need to keep an eye on this. Of course, this is not new. This is not something that I've said, out of the blue. This has been recognized for a very long time. I'm old enough to remember these problems going back into the 1970s, when this was the primary weakness of the UK economy, the lack of investment in new plant and machinery, in technology, in infrastructure, and in people. We did recover some of this in the 1980s and 1990s, but in the last decade, in the last 20 years, some would say, we slowed down again. We're beginning to show signs of weakening in terms of our infrastructure. And I mean that in the widest possible sense. So it's important to appreciate that. Sadly, I think it's inevitable that a number of companies will face bankruptcy, particularly in certain sectors. We're seeing it already, of course, in the high street, in the retail sector, as people move from physical shopping environments to online shopping. And of course, many of these businesses will not come back again. This is what's known as scarring effect, the permanent changes in our economy post-COVID and post-Brexit that will bring about changes that will not be reversible. I've mentioned already, and I just, in conclusion, mention it again, unemployment is rising and will continue to rise for some time. If it rises only to around about 8%, I think that'll be a great relief. That's the Bank of England's forecast. But of course, it's going to be spread across the country in different ways, in different skill sectors. Different regions of the country will be affected by this. It won't be, of course, evenly spread. And I mentioned the word scarring. I'll just repeat my point. There are changes taking place in the economy today as a result of COVID and as a result of Brexit that will leave a permanent scar on the economy. There'll be some people who will lose their jobs, who may not get employment for a very long time. There are some companies that will close down, that will not reopen. That's what we mean by scarring, a permanent mark on the economy. And you could argue, well, that will create opportunities as well. Yes, I agree. We are a dynamic economy. Maybe I'd like us to be more dynamic, but we will bounce back. But the problem is, can everybody bounce back? Can every business bounce back? Let me give you a very simple example of what I mean by this. The people working in the physical retail sector on the high street, if they lose their jobs as retail outlets close, and because we go to online shopping, the same people who were serving you in the shop before will not be the same people serving you online. So there's a skills mismatch, which is why we're going to need to invest a lot of money in retraining people very quickly. And I don't think it'll happen quick enough for some people, sadly. A few other points. Of course, I mentioned already the spiraling government debt is with us for decades. First of all, they've got to slow down the amount of borrowing each year before they are able to stop the mountain of debt, the national debt, from growing further. But this is not going to be a short-term problem. This is absolutely a long-term problem. And I'll remind you what I said before. Thankfully, the cost of servicing the debt, the huge debt of over 100% of GDP, is affordable, but it's affordable because long-term bond yields are at historic lows. The 10-year government bond yield at the moment is about, I haven't checked this morning, but it's about 0.4%. 10-year government bond yield providing a yield of 0.4%. In Germany, it's actually negative, by the way. People are lending money to the German government for 10 years and getting a negative return. That's to do with confidence. They'd rather lend the money to the government than put it under the bed or put it into the bank even. I think we're going to have unavoidable widespread tax increases. I don't know who's going to face the greatest burden. We're all going to be guessing this for some time to come. And next year's budget, well, it may not do very much in tackling the debt burden. It depends on the state of the economy. The government is clearly not going to slam the brakes on until they're sure we're on a steady growth path. But then we have to be prepared for tax increases. And, you know, it would be great if the household budgets improved faster, but there's going to be a very slow improvement. Again, the second furlough scheme is a great relief to many people, and we should be grateful for that. But I can't imagine many people getting big pay rises, certainly this year or next year. And many people will be glad to be in a job, and let's hope they stay in their jobs in the coming months and years. So I don't see any significant improvement in household budgets. Very small rises in average earnings, despite low inflation. You know, I think real wages will not rise very much. And of course, then there's the prospect of tax increases later. And then, of course, the biggest risk of all, from a health perspective, is more waves of this virus. We're in the second wave, but is there a third wave? Will there be more lockdowns? I don't know. I know as little or as much as you do. We're just keeping our fingers crossed that the current lockdown does the trick. But it's not going to get rid of the virus. It's simply going to slow down the spread until the next wave or until the vaccine arrives. And let's hope that the speculation about a vaccine sometime around Christmas is true. The vaccine itself, I just mentioned it, even if a vaccine is available at Christmas, remember there's the physical challenge of producing enough vaccine, and then the challenge of distributing it around the country, as well as around the world, by the way. I have this fear. What if we all get the vaccine, but we don't allow people into the country because they haven't got the vaccine? I wonder, are countries going to impose a certificate as proof of vaccine? Are we still going to see the airline industry struggling as a result of people not being allowed to travel unless they can prove they've got the vaccine? These are all things that are being talked about, and I have no idea what the outcome will be. But last but not least, we've left the EU. We're trying to negotiate a trade deal. We haven't yet got a trade deal with the EU. And so there is a risk. I don't want to put it more strongly than that. There's a risk of failing to achieve a free trade agreement with the EU. Clearly, the government saying, why can't we have an Australian type deal? Why not a Canada type deal? The Canada deal, by the way, is a deal on free trade on manufactured goods, on physical goods. Why can't we have one of those? Well, it took Canada 7 years to negotiate that. And we've got 7 weeks remaining. Now, it may happen. I don't know. But all I point out is a failure to achieve a deal and to go into January the 1st with no deal is a risk. The Bank of England predicts that if that happens, if there is no deal, there will be a hit on the economy. They do expect a slowdown in the early part of next year. And there will be companies arriving at the port of Dover, or vice versa, at Calais, who won't have the proper paperwork. Trucks will be piling up, unless some magical trick takes place. I just don't see that happening. But I'm an optimist, as I've said several times already. So on that note, with just a couple of minutes to go, I'm going to conclude just by giving you a quotation which was produced just recently by the Institute for Fiscal Studies, which I thought was a measured statement and not one. And IFS is not prone to exaggeration. Their view is, and I absolutely agree with it, adjustment to a post-COVID, post-Brexit new normal will have economic costs that last into the long term. That's the reality that we face. And there's no point in pretending otherwise. All of us are going to have to figure out for ourselves, for our businesses, for our economy, what does a new normal look like? Is it going to be more online business? Are we going to have more Zoom meetings like this? Is it going to be barriers or blockages at borders? Is it going to be more expensive imported food? Is it going to be more local production? I mean, all of these are questions you're all facing. I just wish I could give you clearer answers, but nobody has clearer answers at the moment. And therefore, I promised earlier that there will be time for Q&A, and that will come at the end of this morning. I'm going to be online, and I hope that you'll have some questions for us. Now I must stop sharing and pass back, but thank you for listening, and I look forward to our next speaker. Many thanks.
Thanks very much, Joe. As ever, fascinating take on the economic situation. I always find listening to Joe that he has such a relaxed and calm approach that you take in all the doom and gloom that he's actually telling us about with a much easier heart than you might otherwise feel. So thanks very much for that. And I know Joe is waiting around. I can see there are one or two questions there that have come in for him while he's been speaking. And Joe, if you wanted to go back to those people, then feel free. But yes, I know you're around till the end.
Sure.
And if there are more questions involving your bit, then no doubt we can deal with them at the end. It's now time for me to hand over to our indirect tax team. And the indirect tax side of Brexit is without doubt the most important one in terms of practical measures you need to take, and action you need to take sooner rather than later if you haven't already done so. There are some direct tax issues, but it's the indirect tax side that is by far, I think, the most immediately relevant to you. So I'm going to hand you over now to Alison and the rest of the indirect tax team, who will hopefully take you through a number of slides. I think we've overcome most of our technical challenges now. So Alison, I hope you're there. Please take it away.
I am here. Thank you very much, Patrick, and hope everybody can hear me. So let's remind ourselves, if we could go to the first slide, of the basics of Brexit. We've left the EU. We're in a transitional period. That's not going to be extended. Boris had his deadline of the 15th of October. That's passed. The European Union had their deadline of the 31st of October, and that too has passed. We hear a lot about the intense talks taking place, which is very encouraging. As Joe said, we only have 7 weeks to go. We hear one day that things are going really well and we might be close to a deal. And then just yesterday I heard, no, it looks like we're on a no deal again. But that's a lot of negotiating noise, as we'd all expect. So whatever happens, from the 1st of January, all movements of goods between the UK and Europe will become exports and imports. And that is a whole different ballgame to the simplified intra-EU trade rules that we will look back with much fondness on. They're going to disappear. So the spotlight is very, very firmly on customs duty. And to a lesser extent, and packing a really big punch, is the spotlight on VAT, because businesses have got to be able to deal with these issues. So we're talking about, this time it's for real. As Joe was saying, it's difficult to have really clear answers without knowing what the free trade agreement, if there is one, will be. But we do have lots of things that are real and practical that we can be doing to make sure that we are putting our best foot forward in dealing with this big challenge. We're going to be concentrating mainly on goods because these are the things that are critically affected. And Jonathan and Marissa are going to highlight some key VAT changes affecting services as we go through. Just to sum up, a deal means that we have free trade and 0% tariffs. A no deal means we have the additional cost, which is a bottom line hit to you of customs duties. No matter what we have, deal or no deal, we still have those customs declarations and those VAT issues that we have to deal with. So let's go to the next slide and have a look at the timeline that we were all working to. So we're now into November. we've passed all those deadline days. We are now looking at, there was a deadline of the 26th of November, which was the original deadline, where our deal has to be presented to the European Parliament in order for it to be passed in time to be legislated for. As we've all seen, there is no rhyme or reason to deadlines in this type of extreme situation. So if we move on, I think, first poll question, if you wouldn't mind, let's just refresh. How are you all doing with your Brexit preparations? Have you not done anything yet? You don't know where to start, or we're all set? It'd be great if you wouldn't mind just answering that, please. Thank you. I'm not sure whether the answers are going to pop up on a slide. So I think we'll move to the next slide just in case, unless Sarah tells me otherwise. Okay, we'll come back to that poll result. Marissa, I'd be really interested if you could let us know what the news is saying in mainland Europe.
Yeah, well, the news is really into businesses. Make sure that you are prepared. Get ready for a Brexit with a no deal, or get ready for a Brexit whereby the UK is being considered, Alison, as a non-EU country from a VAT and customs perspective. So, for example, the Dutch government is really calling businesses to arrange EORI numbers, VAT numbers where necessary, etc., etc.
Thanks, Marissa. And thank you very much for everybody voting. It's really great to see that 36%, sorry, I can just see that, 36% of people are ready. 27% of people have not done anything yet, but please don't despair. There's a lot you can do, and we're going to guide you on that today. And 37% not really sure where to start. Again, let's talk through how we can help you know where to start. Okay, if we could move on to the next slide, please. We're going to now look at the customs duty and import changes and how these are going to affect UK businesses and EU businesses. And here I'm going to ask Andrew if he could give us some insight into the UK tariff and the European tariff.
Thank you, Alison. Yes. So as the UK is leaving the European Union, the UK have set up their own global tariff. So for all movements of goods in or out of the UK, there will be a requirement to declare a commodity code on any customs declaration. So the first task for any company that hasn't really been involved in intrastat or third country imports and exports is to identify the commodity code. So once you've identified the commodity code, you can then confirm the duty rate that will be applicable for your goods and obviously establish whether you need to adjust your pricing structure. So the UK global tariff was introduced in May this year, but will come into force from the 1st of January. There's a number of changes compared to the European tariff. The first being the simplification of the commodity codes into bandings. So they'll move up to 4, 6, 8, 10, up to 20%. So if you've got a product at the moment, say for instance, plastic articles under Chapter 39, at the moment it's likely to have a duty rate of 6.5%. That will be reduced down to 6% as the nearest banding. Everything will drop down, it won't go up. The other change is the scrapping of nuisance tariffs. So anything with a tariff rate of 2% or less will be dropped down to zero duty. There's also the removal of the complicated calculations for cap goods, so common agricultural products, which resulted in the requirement to add an additional code. So that's being scrapped to make it a lot easier for companies to determine the commodity code and the duty rate that is going to be applicable. So there is a web link that you can go to that provides the global tariff Obviously, it doesn't detail anything in relation to preferential trade rates. So if you're importing for somebody like Israel, there'll be a preferential rate. That will come online from the 1st of January once everything's been formalised. But the good thing about the tariff is it gives you the European rate and also the UK rate. So you can look at your imports and exports and know what code is applicable in both instances. You can also export either the whole tariff or parts of the tariff, whatever you're looking for, into either a CSV or an Excel spreadsheet file. So it's useful to be able to interrogate that data away from the website.
Thanks, Andrew. I think that if you've done nothing, if you're one of those businesses who hasn't started yet, if you do that, it will put your mind at rest. You'll know what you're dealing with, and it is quite straightforward to do. One really good change that's going to be taking place from the 1st of January is for any UK VAT registered business. So you don't need to be a UK company, you can be an overseas company, but you're registered for VAT in the UK. When you declare your goods to import them into the UK, provided you declare them as being subject to postponed VAT accounting, you won't pay import VAT at the port of entry. And Jonathan's going to be looking at what this means for your VAT return further on. So that's really good news. And I think that also then, Andrew, links in to duty deferment accounts. And there have been some recent announcements there as well, haven't there?
Yes, obviously companies who are going to be importing goods into the UK are likely to require a duty deferment account. It's basically like a credit card system with HMRC. So you accrue your customs duties and taxes at import over the period of a month. You'll have a specific bank account set up, and at the end of each month, HMRC take that tax out of that account. So it's a good way of being able to ensure that goods are quickly cleared without having to make a manual payment or arrange for a payment once the goods have arrived. It's just putting the deferment account number on the import declaration. Those duties are allocated to that account and the goods are cleared. One of the developments that came out last week, which we were expecting, but it's still good news, is that for companies who've got good compliance with HMRC and good financial standing, they can apply for a guarantee waiver. So at the moment, having a duty deferment account, you need a customs comprehensive guarantee that covers 2 months worth of your import duty liability. But HMRC are now going to allow for waivers for companies who they consider to be meeting their requirements. If it's below £10,000 monthly duty liability, you don't need to provide additional information. But if it's above that £10,000 per month, they'll need additional accounting details, management accounts, and be able to prove that you've got the relevant net assets in place to cover any potential customs debt.
So that's another really good measure and looking after businesses. And I think it's also worth pointing out that change to the postponed import VAT accounting also takes the import VAT out of that duty deferment amount that you've got to provide for under your bank guarantee. So if for businesses that have got a bank guarantee that covers both import VAT and customs duty, you need to be looking at that and reducing the guarantee levels, which is obviously good news for you. And if we move on to the next one, Marissa, there are some major e-commerce changes happening. The low value consignment relief. So if you're buying something from, say, the US or China, it's 22 euros and below. That will be import VAT and duty free when it comes into the UK. That is being scrapped. There are quite significant. It's been scrapped in the UK, but not in Europe for 6 months. And Jonathan and Marissa are going to cover this because there's a lot of implications. And as the world is run on e-commerce these days, important news to cover. And Andrew, big changes to Northern Ireland, which is an ongoing saga, really, isn't it?
Yeah. So at the moment, Northern Ireland is separate from the current free trade talks. There's a separate committee tasked with sorting everything out. Under the Northern Ireland Protocol, obviously there are in issues relating to customs and VAT where the liability falls and what rules Northern Ireland will follow. But one of the big changes for GB exporters into Northern Ireland is the requirement to make some form of a declaration to get those goods into Northern Ireland. And to be able to do that, the government are setting up a new computer declaration system called the Trader Support System. I've just had an announcement while we've been on this meeting to say that it's now pretty much ready for people to go in. But if you go into the .gov website, there's a link to get a registration for it. And what that will do is that will, if you do it before the 23rd of November, it will set up your Northern Ireland EORI number, the economic operating number, which is it starts with an XI and will have your UK VAT number next to it, just to allow you to be able to use that system. The bit that we're not sure about yet is how it's going to operate, who's going to be able to put that information in, whether it's yourselves or hauliers when they do it. But it's basically to manage the export of the goods into Northern Ireland to evidence it's a GB shipment. There's also the possibility of having to pay customs duties, which will be rebatable as everything else is going on. We're not sure yet how that system will work, but there's a possibility of customs duties being liable on import into Northern Ireland if it can't be evidenced that the goods are going to remain in Northern Ireland. If they're at risk of going into Southern Ireland, then those duties will be liable. And once they've been sold, you'll be able to claim the rebated amount.
So if you have a Northern Ireland market or a place of business in Northern Ireland, there's much for you to get your head around here. And certainly, please look at the Trader Support System, which is a simple registration at this stage. And then if we move on to the commercial side of trading with Europe going forward, if you've just been trading into EU at the moment, you may not have had to deal with Incoterms as such. You may have a commercial contract that says I'll deliver to you, or you may have a commercial contract that says, well, you're going to pick it up from the door. As we said, declarations are going to be all important in a deal or no deal situation, and Incoterms are going to have to be reflected on that paperwork, and they're going to determine who is going to be responsible for that customs duty, if there is any, who's going to be responsible for paying it, and that's a big thing. And if those conversations have not happened yet and you've not sorted out the Incoterms, we would urge you to have those conversations as soon as possible, because they're going to have knock-on VAT implications as well. So Andrew, do you want to talk us through on the next slide the Incoterms?
Yeah, so these were recently updated in 2020. Some minor changes, but nothing major. But if you look at both ends of the spectrum, if you're ex-works, you're buying those goods from a customer in the EU, from a supplier in the EU, you will arrange for the movement of those goods from Europe into the UK. You'll be responsible for the export declaration and the import declaration into the UK. So there's a chance that you need to have an EU EORI number to declare those goods out of the EU, but you'll also be responsible for the import duties and import VAT, and have a UK EORI and VAT registration to reclaim the import VAT back. At the other end of the spectrum, you've got deliver duty paid. So the seller basically arranges for everything to your doorstep. All you do is receive those goods. They are the ones that are responsible for the customs export declaration and import declaration, and pay all the customs duties if they're applicable. They would have a requirement to have a UK EORI and, in all likelihood, register for VAT to reclaim any VAT back. So obviously, determining at what point you want your responsibilities to start is a discussion with your customers, your suppliers. In some instances, we're seeing that the customer is determined to force their supplier to work under DDP terms, which, if you're a UK exporter, you've got the liability to register it in the EU for certain purposes. So if you're supplying into various different member states, it's organising your supply chain to minimise that sort of impact and requirement to register in various states. So it's a major issue to look at, and also depending on which term you're using, if you're responsible for the customs duties, then you obviously need to make sure that you are aware of the commodity codes, the duty rates, so you can factor that into any sort of costings for your sales price.
Thanks, Andrew. If we move on to our next slide, that gives you a bit of a visual about the Incoterms that Andrew was just talking about. So we're looking here at business-to-business trade in goods. So if we are over in the UK, we're selling X works, you're not responsible for the import into Europe. You're not even responsible for the export declaration. And that's a concern which Jonathan, I think, is going to be picking up on. And I think that export declaration is something that we all need to think about, because those goods have got to leave the country. So if you've got good relationships with your customers and they're not prepared to be able to deal with that export declaration, then their goods are not going to leave the UK, and it's going to impact your relationships. So I think those sorts of discussions with your customers are really important about what the paperwork must look like, and what the terms are going to be, and how they're going to facilitate dealing with those declarations. DDP we talked about, and Marissa and Jonathan are going to pick up on that. And also one term that, if you were looking to avoid having to register, consider if DAP, so that's delivered at place. You're responsible to, as a seller, for the export declaration, but your customer might take on the importer of record responsibilities. And I think at that stage, it's passing over to Marissa to start off looking at, oh no, it's not. Apologies, Marissa. Apologies. Let's go back. We just need to talk to you about the customs relief regimes, because in a no deal, and even in a deal situation, these things, you'll have heard them mentioned before, and Andrew's going to talk us through them. Customs warehousing and inward processing relief are two things that are going to be very important in minimising and making customs duty as efficient as it can be. Andrew, over to you.
Okay, so if you're a company that has a supply chain that includes goods coming in from China, for instance, but you send those goods out into the UK market, into the EU market, or even back out of the EU to America or wherever, the likelihood is that a customs warehouse would benefit your business. You don't have to have your own warehouse, you can use a third-party warehouse. But all that means is that you can import those goods from China and not incur the customs duty and import VAT at the time of arrival. They'll get stored under duty suspense in a customs warehouse, and then only on release will the tax point occur. So if you sold them into the UK, the removal declaration would account for any customs duty and import VAT. If you exported the goods out into the EU or out of the EU to the US, that would be an export declaration and discharge any customs duty liability. You could also store the goods, and you could be a supplier to a manufacturer who, if they've got inward processing relief, you can transfer those goods to them and they can put it under their inward processing relief. That would discharge your liability for the customs duties as well. So it's an important thing to consider to make sure that you don't incur any customs duty, because if you're then having to ship under DDP terms into Europe, you could incur the customs duty when it goes into Europe as well. So if you imported from China, paid the customs duty in the UK, and then had to ship them out to your customer in the EU, there's a likelihood you'd have to pay the customs duty on import into the EU as well. And we're aware of a number of companies who import, for instance, textile goods at 12%. If they're responsible for getting those goods to their customer, there's a potential 24% customs duty that they'd have to incur just to get those goods from their supplier to their customer. So obviously something like a customs warehouse would at least minimise that or half that duty liability. So if you move on to inward processing, that's for companies who have who either import goods for repair, They might sell the goods into the EU market, but they do any sort of servicing or recalibration. You can be approved for inward processing to import those goods under duty suspense, complete any repairs, and re-export them back out, so you don't incur any customs duty or import VAT liability. For companies who manufacture, you can be set up for inward processing relief, so that you can source materials from all over the world. Those goods that come into the UK would be entered under inward processing, no payment of customs duty or import VAT. The duty would only be liable if you sold the finished product in the UK. So if you re-exported that finished product out of the UK, that discharges the liability for any import duties. So that again would minimise your liability for customs duty if you've got a number of customers that you know are going to be outside the UK. The other additional one is CFSP, so Customs Freight Simplified Procedures. It's a consideration for companies who are involved in customs warehousing. It tends to be an add-on to that, but basically what that is it allows companies to have access to the HMRC declaration systems to submit their own customs declarations. I say with customs warehousing, you might import a trailer or a container load in, but that container could be broken down and you could export or sell an individual shirt. The customs declarations to remove from a warehouse are significantly higher than the imports in. So CFSP would allow you to aggregate and consolidate declarations by commodity code to reduce that declaration requirement. The final one we've got on the list is approved exporter. So if we do get a trade deal with the EU, rules of origin and origin of goods will become a major issue for businesses. So if you're an importer or if you're a manufacturer of goods and you want to export to the EU, at the moment without a deal, there'll have to be a full rate of duty going into the EU. If we do get a deal, if you can evidence that the goods meet the rules of origin and therefore can be considered to be UK originating goods, you can export those goods into Europe under cover of a preference certificate or an invoice declaration, which would mean that either a 0% or a reduced rate of customs duty would be liable on import into the EU. So that's why with an approved exporter, you can apply to HMRC, which will allow you to have pre-authenticated preference certificates, which means you don't have to send it off for stamping every single time. So there's a cost saving there. And it also speeds the process along. Or you can apply to have invoice declarations, so a statement on your invoice, which means you don't have to change your processes too much. It's all on your invoice, stating the origin, and you've evidenced to HMRC that the goods do originate as per the rules of origin.
Thanks, Andrew. If we just flick to the next two slides, just illustrate what a customs warehouse, how that works. And likewise, the next one looks at inward processing relief, and again, how that works and how the duty is suspended. As Joe was saying, we've only got 7 weeks until we leave. So applying for a customs warehouse and inward processing within 7 weeks is going to be difficult, and you're not going to be able to secure such an authorisation in that short time frame. But I believe, Andrew, that for inward processing relief, an approval could be backdated to the 1st of January.
Yeah, so there's the ability to ask for a retrospective application. So you could, if you can't get your application in by the 1st of January, or it doesn't get approved by the 1st of January, you can ask for it to be retrospected to the 1st of January. So even though you'd have to import those goods, pay the full rate of duty and VAT at that particular point until you're approved, once you've been approved, provided you've operated as per your authorization, you can ask for those goods, those declarations to be amended so that you can reclaim the duty and the VAT back.
So that's good news for inward processing. But I think for customs warehousing, if people are interested in using customs warehousing, then as a short-term measure, they may need to look to a third-party customs warehouse to support them.
Yeah, like I say, you don't have to have your own customs warehouse. You can use a third-party warehouse to store your goods. So it might be that you've only got one particular product, or it's not worthwhile setting up your own facility to be a customs warehouse. So using a third party warehouse to do that for you would obviously potentially be beneficial with the duty savings, but it's an analysis of the amount of duty that you're going to potentially save in a 12-month period against the costs of using a customs warehouse.
That's great. Thanks. So Marissa, I think if we just go to the Northern Ireland slide, I think that all that we have to add there is that we've talked to you about the trader support system and the fact that you'll get an NI URI number if you register before the 23rd of November. It's anybody who is a Northern Ireland business, by which I mean they would have an establishment over there, will also get a Northern Ireland VAT number, which will then allow them to trade under normal intra-EU rules from Northern Ireland to the rest of Europe. So if you're in that marketplace, there is a lot to look to there. And that's really most of our comments on customs duty. And now we want to move over to Marissa and Jonathan to talk to us about VAT. Thank you.